The sky above New Terra Colony burned crimson as the twin suns began their slow descent beyond the jagged horizon. Lieutenant David Hayes squinted through the atmospheric haze, his practiced eye scanning for disturbances along the settlement's outer perimeter. 6 years stationed at this remote outpost had taught him to recognize the warning signs of trouble. The unusual silence made his skin prickle with unease. No insect chatter, no wind rustling through the native silver-leaf vegetation, just the haunting stillness that preceded danger. "Proximity alert at Sector 7," crackled a voice through his comm unit. "Unidentified vessel approaching fast." David's muscles tensed as adrenaline flooded his system. "Copy that. Scramble defense teams to the eastern quadrant. I want eyes on that ship before it breaches our airspace." He sprinted toward the command center, boots kicking up rust-colored dust as colonial alarms began to wail across the settlement. This far from Earth's protective fleet, they were vulnerable. A fact that kept him awake during the colony's brief nights. The mining outpost held strategic value, its reserves of stellarium ore making it a tempting target for raiders and worse. The command center buzzed with controlled chaos as technicians monitored incoming data. Lieutenant Sophia Chen, his second in command, looked up from the holographic display, her expression grim. "Sir, vessel identification confirms it's not one of ours. Design appears to be Valkyrie in origin." The room fell silent. Everyone present knew what that meant. The Valkyrie hadn't come to trade or negotiate. They'd come to destroy. 3 colonies had already fallen to their attacks in the past solar year, with no survivors left to tell the tale. Only surveillance footage retrieved weeks later revealed the brutal efficiency of their assaults. "How long until impact?" David asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. 17 minutes, sir. They're on a direct collision course with the residential sector." David made the call instantly. "Initiate emergency evacuation protocol. Get everyone to the underground shelters. And prep the long-range beacon. Earth Command needs to know what's happening here." The settlement transformed into a flurry of desperate activity. Families grabbed only what they could carry. Children clutched treasured possessions as they were hurried toward safety. David coordinated defense teams, knowing full well they were merely buying time rather than mounting a genuine resistance. That's when he saw her, a slender figure moving against the flow of evacuees, heading toward the perimeter instead of away from it. She wore simple colony attire, but something about her deliberate movements caught his attention. She moved with purpose, head down, clearly trying to avoid notice. "You there, stop," he called out, breaking into a run when she quickened her pace. The woman darted between storage units, surprisingly fast and clearly familiar with the colony's layout. When David rounded the corner, he caught a glimpse of her face, features unmarked by the hardship of colonial life, skin too smooth for someone who'd spent years under the harsh radiation of twin suns. She wasn't one of them. "Security breach in Sector 4, he reported into his comm. "Unknown female subject, possibly hostile." But he received only static in response. The Valkyrie were jamming their communications now. The attack was imminent. David continued his pursuit alone, tracking the mystery woman to an abandoned maintenance shed near the colony's edge. When he burst through the door, weapon drawn, he found her hunched over what appeared to be an advanced communication. The Valkyrie attack had begun. "There's no time," she insisted, rising to her feet. "I can stop this, but I need to reach the northern ridge. You expect me to trust you, while my people are dying." Her expression hardened. "Your people will all die if you don't. This isn't a random attack. They're here for me." Another explosion, closer this time, sent dust raining from the ceiling. David's training told him to detain her, to treat her as the security threat she clearly was. But his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through 2 border conflicts, whispered that there was more to her story. "You have 5 minutes to convince me," he said, lowering his weapon slightly. "My name is Lyra," she began, her fingers still working the strange device. "That's all I can tell you about myself. But what matters now is that I possess information that could end the Valkyrie threat permanently. Information they would kill an entire colony to suppress. A direct hit to the nearby power station plunged them into darkness, emergency lights casting eerie shadows across Lyra's determined face. "They're getting closer," David warned. "I need access to your colony's central communications array. With the right modifications, I can broadcast a signal that will disable their weapon systems temporarily, enough time for your people to escape." David hesitated. Trusting her meant gambling with the lives of everyone under his protection. "If I wanted to harm your colony," she said softly, reading his thoughts, "I would have done it already." Another explosion, this one close enough to shake the shed's foundation. Through the small window, David could see the first Valkyrie dropships descending through the atmosphere, their distinctive blade-like silhouettes cutting through the smoke-filled sky. "Fine," he decided, "but you stay in front of me, and I'll shoot you myself if I suspect you're leading us into a trap." They raced through the colony, now a landscape of chaos and destruction. Bodies lay crumpled in the streets, colonists who hadn't reached shelter in time. David forced himself to look away, channeling his rage into determination. If Lyra was telling the truth, there was still hope. If she wasn't, well, they'd all be dead anyway. At the communications array, Lyra worked with astonishing speed, her fingers dancing across the controls with practiced precision. David kept his weapon trained on the entrance, firing at the first Valkyrie soldier who appeared in the doorway. "How much longer?" he shouted over the din of battle. 30 seconds, she replied, not looking up from her work. The air around them grew thick with the acrid smell of charged particle weapons. David took down 2 more attackers, but he knew more would come. They were outnumbered, outgunned. "It's done," Lyra announced, just as a section of the roof collapsed nearby. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a high-pitched whine filled the air as the Valkyrie ships faltered, their engines sputtering as they lost altitude. "Now we run," she said, grabbing his arm. They fled toward the evacuation point, but their path was cut off by a squad of Valkyrie warriors, their biomechanical armor making them appear more machine than living being. David shoved Lyra behind him just as energy blasts seared the air around them. "Get down," he yelled, returning fire. In that moment, as he placed himself between her and certain death, Lieutenant David Hayes had no idea that the woman he was protecting was far more than she appeared, that beneath her disguise as a simple colonist lay the last heir to the galactic Concordat, Princess Lyra Estrella, whose very existence threatened the Valkyrie's plans for domination. And as the battle raged around them, with his body shielding hers from the relentless onslaught, neither of them knew that this chance encounter would change not just their lives, but the fate of human civilization across the stars. The air crackled with energy discharge as David pulled Lyra behind a fallen support beam. His tactical training took over, eyes scanning their surroundings for an escape route while his mind calculated their dwindling odds of survival. The Valkyrie warriors advanced methodically, their synchronized movements betraying their hive-mind battle coordination. "Stay close," David whispered, the warmth of Lyra's shoulder against his back oddly comforting amid the chaos. "When I move, you move. Understand?" She nodded, her composure remarkable for someone supposedly untrained in combat. He'd seen hardened colonial marines crack under less pressure, yet her hands remained steady as she clutched the strange device she'd refused to leave behind. A brief lull in the Valkyrie fire gave them their opening. David grabbed Lyra's hand, and they sprinted toward a maintenance tunnel, diving inside as energy blasts scorched the ground behind them. The narrow passage stank of hydraulic fluid and rust, but it would shield them from sensors, temporarily. "You've said they're here for you," David panted as they crawled through the darkness. Time to explain why an entire Valkyrie death fleet would hunt down one woman. Lyra hesitated, her violet eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. "The less you know about me, the safer you'll be." That ship sailed when you put my entire colony in danger, he snapped, fatigue sharpening his words. People I've protected for 6 years are dying out there. I deserve answers. A distant explosion rattled dust from the tunnel ceiling. David checked the charge on his pulse rifle. 3, maybe 4 shots before it was useless. The colony's standard-issue weapons were hardly designed for alien invasions. What I know could topple empires, Lyra finally said, her voice barely audible. The Valkyrie aren't simply raiders or conquerors. They're puppets, biological weapons deployed by something far worse. David's mind flashed back to his military intelligence briefings. Official reports classified the Valkyrie as a sovereign aggressive species from the City Quadrant. Nothing had ever suggested they weren't acting independently. What exactly are you saying? The entity that controls them is called the Nexus, she continued, eyes darting nervously toward the tunnel entrance. It's ancient, patient, and has been infiltrating human governance structures for decades. My father discovered proof of this, classified star charts showing Nexus influence spreading methodically through our territories. David's mouth went dry. Your father? A bitter smile crossed her face. High Chancellor Estrella of the Galactic Concordat, or he was, until his shuttle mysteriously malfunctioned 3 weeks ago. The pieces suddenly clicked into terrible clarity. Chancellor Estrella's death had been broadcast across every colonial frequency. A tragic accident, it said. A state funeral watched by billions across human space. You're Lyra Estrella, David breathed, recognition dawning. The heir apparent who disappeared from the Concordat capital. The heir apparent who was about to be assassinated, she corrected. The same day my father died, my personal security detail was compromised. If not for my father's contingency plans, I would be dead too. Another explosion, closer this time. They needed to keep moving. Why here? New Terra is nothing. A forgotten mining outpost at the edge of charted space. Because of what's beneath us, Lyra said as they resumed crawling through the tunnel. Your colony wasn't established for Stellarium. That's the cover story. The real reason is buried 2 kilometers beneath the southern plateau. An ancient data repository my father discovered. One of 3 across human space containing evidence of Nexus infiltration. David's mind reeled with implications. If true, everything he'd fought for, the border conflicts, the colonial defense initiatives, had been orchestrated conflicts, puppet shows to distract humanity, while something else pulled strings from the shadows. They emerged from the tunnel into what remained of the colony's hydroponics section. Shattered glass crunched beneath their boots, precious crops exposed to the toxic elements of New Terra's atmosphere. They'd wither within hours, another small death in a day full of them. The signal you broadcast, David said. What did it really do? Lyra's expression darkened. It activated a dormant defense system that's been hiding in plain sight within Valkyrie technology. A backdoor protocol developed by scientists loyal to my father. It won't hold them for long, but it's buying your colonists time to reach the emergency shelters. And where exactly are we going? To the repository, she answered. I need to extract the data before the Valkyrie recover. It's our only chance of exposing the Nexus. David laughed bitterly. You're talking about a theoretical bunker 2 kilometers underground, while we're surrounded by hostile forces with minimal weapons and no backup. Not entirely without backup, Lyra replied, removing a small metallic disc from her pocket. She pressed its center, and it hummed to life, projecting a 3-dimensional map of the colony and surrounding terrain. A pulsing red dot appeared several kilometers to the east. What am I looking at? My extraction team. Loyalists who've been tracking me since I arrived on New Terra 3 days ago. They're waiting for my signal. David stared at her, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. You've been hiding among us for 3 days, and I never noticed. How? Your colony needed a new atmospheric systems technician, she said with a hint of pride. I filled the vacancy. The realization stung. David prided himself on knowing every face in his colony, yet she'd slipped right past him. It made him question what else he might have missed. A distant rumble shook the ground, different from the explosions. David recognized it immediately as dropship engines powering up. "They're leaving the colony," he said, moving to a shattered viewport. In the distance, Valkyrie ships ascended toward their orbiting destroyers. "Why would they withdraw when they have us outnumbered?" Lyra's face paled. "Because they're going to glass the planet from orbit. Standard protocol when direct infiltration fails." Glass the words died in David's throat as the horrifying reality sank in. Orbital bombardment would kill everyone, not just in the colony, but across the entire continental shelf. Thousands of lives erased to keep Lyra's secret buried. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less, she replied, fingers dancing across her projection device. "We need to move now. The repository has shielding that might protect us, and my team can extract us after the initial bombardment." David's chest tightened with an impossible choice. His duty was to his colonists, to ensure their evacuation. Yet if what Lyra said was true, the information she sought could save billions across human space. "My people first," he said firmly. "I won't abandon them. We divert to the main shelter, make sure the evacuation is complete, then I'll help you reach your repository." Lyra opened her mouth to argue but stopped, something in his expression giving her pause. "You'd risk everything, the evidence, exposing the Nexus, for a few hundred colonists. That's what separates us from them," David replied, checking his weapon. "Every human life matters." "Isn't that what your father believed? What the Concordat stands for?" Something shifted in Lyra's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or a reawakened principle long buried beneath layers of survival and duty. For the first time, David glimpsed not just the princess or the fugitive, but the woman beneath both masks. "You're right," she said softly. "We save your people first." They moved through the ruins of the colony, keeping to shadows as the sky above them darkened with gathering Valkyrie warships. David led them through maintenance passages and emergency routes known only to security personnel, his mind calculating and recalculating their odds. What neither of them realized was that among the colonial evacuation, hidden behind a carefully crafted human disguise, an agent of the Nexus was already tracking their movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Smoke hung thick in the air as David and Lyra approached the main evacuation shelter, a reinforced bunker complex originally designed to protect miners from atmospheric toxicity events. David's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a reminder of the seconds ticking away. Above them, the sky had turned an unnatural purple-black as Valkyrie destroyers moved into bombardment formation. "Colonial security override. Hayes Delta 7 Niner." David spoke into the bunker's authentication panel. The heavy blast. Doors groaned open, revealing a scene of organized chaos inside. Hundreds of colonists huddled in the cavernous main chamber, families clustered together on emergency cots, medical staff tending to the injured. The air was dense with fear and the peculiar silence of collective shock. These people had built lives here, had transformed a hostile world into a home, and now faced losing everything they'd created. Lieutenant Chen spotted them immediately, pushing through the crowd with visible relief on her face. "Sir, we thought you were." Her eyes narrowed when she noticed Lyra. "Who's this?" "Someone who's going to help us," David answered, sidestepping the question. "Status report." 273 colonists accounted for, Chen replied, professional despite her obvious suspicion. 42 wounded, 17 critical. "We've lost contact with the northwestern residential sector. At least 50 people unaccounted for." David's stomach twisted. 50 souls potentially lost already. What about our defensive capabilities? Automated systems are offline. The colonial militia has established perimeter defense, but if those ships up there open fire, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. 15 minutes, Lyra whispered, checking her device. Maybe less. David made his decision. Chen, prep the emergency transport shuttles. We're evacuating everyone to the Southern Canyon caves. The caves. Chen's eyes widened. Sir, they're unstable and unmapped beyond the first kilometer. They're also surrounded by ferrous rock formations that will partially shield us from orbital sensors, David countered. It's our best chance. Chen hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply. Yes, sir. As she moved away to coordinate the evacuation, David turned to Lyra. Your repository, where exactly is it located? She activated her projection device again, zooming in on a seemingly unremarkable plateau 10 kilometers south of the colony. The entrance is here, disguised as a natural formation. My father's team designed it to be invisible to standard scanning technology, and it's shielded against bombardment. Theoretically, seeing his expression, she added, the repository chambers are lined with ancient alloys we've been unable to replicate. They've survived planetary cataclysms before. David weighed their options. The caves might protect the colonists temporarily, but without proper supplies or long-range communication, they were merely postponing the inevitable. The repository, if it existed as Lyra described, offered their best chance at both survival and getting word to Earth Command. Change of plans, he announced, turning back to Chen. We head for the southern plateau. There's a facility there with proper shielding. Chen's brow furrowed. There's nothing on our maps in that sector. Because it's classified, David replied, the lie coming easily when weighed against their survival. Need to know basis. Now it's need to survive. The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of activity. The colonists mobilized with the efficiency of people accustomed to harsh conditions and emergencies. Ground transports were loaded with supplies and the wounded. David organized security teams from the remaining colonial militia, distributing what weapons they had. Through it all, he kept Lyra close, watching her interact with the colonists. Despite her royal birth, she moved among them with natural ease, helping an elderly man with his breathing apparatus, calming a frightened child with a few gentle words. There was nothing artificial in her compassion. It seemed as ingrained as her determination. You're good with them, David observed during a brief moment alone as they loaded medical supplies. My father believed rulers should serve their people, not command them, she replied, a flash of grief crossing her features. He took me to refugee camps, disaster zones, taught me that privilege means responsibility. Another piece of the puzzle that was Lyra Estrella fell into place. Her father's progressive policies had been controversial among the Concordats' traditional power structures, potentially creating enemies beyond just the mysterious nexus. The ground rumbled beneath them, and David glanced skyward. The Valkyrie ships had begun moving into final position. Time's up, he called out. Everyone move out, now. The convoy of vehicles departed the colony in a plume of dust, racing across the barren landscape toward the southern plateau. David commanded the lead vehicle, with Lyra beside him, and Chen monitoring communications. Behind them, 20 transports carried the remaining population of New Terra Colony. 7 minutes to bombardment range, Lyra warned, eyes fixed on her device. David pressed the accelerator harder, the transport's suspension groaning as they bounced over the rough terrain. Distance to the repository entrance. 6 kilometers, she replied. But there's something wrong. My extraction team's signal is gone. A cold weight settled in David's stomach. Gone as in jammed, or gone as in eliminated, she finished grimly. Chen looked between them, suspicion hardening her features. Extraction team. Repository. You want to tell me what's really going on, Lieutenant? Before David could respond, their transport's proximity alarm blared. Chen checked the scanner. Multiple signatures incoming from the northeast. Fast movers. Through the swirling dust behind them, David spotted them. Valkyrie skimmers, sleek and predatory, cutting across the plains toward their convoy. They're targeting us specifically, Lyra said, her voice tight. They must have realized who I am. Or someone told them, David replied, eyes meeting Chen's in silent communication. The lieutenant nodded almost imperceptibly. Understanding his suspicion, they had a traitor in their ranks. David swerved the transport abruptly, opening a channel to the convoy. All vehicles, evasive pattern Delta. Militia teams, prepare to engage pursuing forces. The convoy scattered into a pre-arranged defensive formation, creating a harder target for the approaching skimmers. The militia transports dropped back, their gunners taking position. The first energy blasts from the Valkyrie skimmers scorched the earth around them, superheating the soil into glass. One struck a transport at the rear of the convoy, sending it tumbling in a ball of flame. David's knuckles whitened on the steering controls as anguished cries echoed over the comm. "We're not going to make it like this," he muttered, scanning the terrain ahead. A narrow ravine cut through the landscape about 2 kilometers ahead, not on their planned route, but potentially offering cover. "Lieutenant Chen, take the lead," he ordered. "Get these people to the following coordinates." He transmitted the ravine's location to her console. "I'll draw them off." Chen's eyes widened. "Sir, that's suicide." "That's an order," he replied firmly, then turned to Lyra. "You're going with her." Lyra's violet eyes flashed with defiance. "No, they want me. If anyone's acting as bait, it should be me." "Which is exactly why you're staying with the convoy," David countered. "You're the only one who can access the repository. If what you say is true, that data is worth more than any of our lives." For a moment, it seemed she would argue further. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pressed a small object into his palm, a data crystal, glowing with faint internal light. "Repository access codes," she explained. "If I don't make it." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition of shared purpose that transcended their brief acquaintance. Chen cleared her throat. "Sir, we need to move." David nodded, bringing the transport to a halt as Chen slid into the driver's seat. "Get them to safety, Lieutenant. That's your mission now." "Don't play the hero, Hayes," Chen replied gruffly, but her eyes communicated what her words couldn't: respect, concern, farewell. As the convoy veered toward the ravine, David took a smaller scout vehicle and headed in the opposite direction, accelerating directly toward the approaching Valkyrie skimmers. His pulse rifle lay across his lap, nearly depleted but still functional enough to make a statement. Through his rearview scanner, he watched the convoy disappear into the ravine, a mixture of relief and resolve washing over him. Whether they reached the repository or not was now beyond his control. His job was simpler: buy them time, at any cost. The Valkyrie skimmers adjusted course, taking the bait. 3 peeled away to pursue the convoy, but 7 turned to intercept him. Far better odds for the colonists than he'd dared hope for. David pushed the scout vehicle to its limits, driving it straight toward a rocky outcropping. At the last possible moment, he swerved, using the terrain to shield him from the first volley of Valkyrie fire. Energy blasts superheated the rocks, sending molten debris raining down around him. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered, firing his rifle at the lead skimmer. "Follow me." What he didn't expect was the sudden explosion that erupted from the convoy's direction, sending a plume of dust and smoke into the sky. David's heart seized as he checked his scanner. The convoy signals were scattering in chaos. They'd been ambushed. And in that moment of distraction, David didn't see the Valkyrie energy blast until it was too late. The world around him erupted into blinding light and searing heat as his vehicle disintegrated. His last conscious thought was of Lyra, not the princess or the fugitive, but the woman who'd helped an old man with his breathing mask, who'd comforted a frightened child, who carried the weight of humanity's future on her shoulders. As darkness claimed him, David Hayes had no way of knowing that the greatest threat to Lyra wasn't the Valkyrie forces surrounding them, or the warships preparing to glass the planet. It was much closer, hidden behind a human face, and already moving into position to complete a mission years in the planning. Pain dragged David back to consciousness, sharp, insistent pain that told him he wasn't dead. Not yet. His eyes fluttered open to a world tinged red with emergency lighting. The scout vehicle's safety pod had deployed, its reinforced shell the only reason he'd survived the Valkyrie blast. He was trapped inside the crumpled remains, the air growing thinner with each labored breath. Through a jagged crack in the pod's viewport, David could see the purplish-black sky where Valkyrie destroyers hovered like patient predators. They hadn't begun the bombardment yet. Why? A distant explosion answered his question. The Valkyrie were still hunting, still searching the ground for their primary target, for Lyra. With trembling fingers, David activated his emergency beacon, though he doubted anyone would respond. His body was a catalog of injuries, 3 broken ribs at least, a dislocated shoulder, and a gash across his forehead that leaked blood into his left eye. But his legs still worked. That would have to be enough. He braced himself against the pain and kicked at the emergency release. The pod's hatch groaned open, allowing dust and the acrid scent of burnt metal to rush in. David dragged himself out, collapsing onto the scorched earth beneath a sky that promised death. His tactical training took over. Assess, plan, act. The convoy had been headed for the ravine leading to the southern plateau when the ambush hit. From his position, he could see plumes of smoke rising from multiple locations, the scattered remains of their vehicles. The Valkyrie skimmers circled the area like vultures, energy weapons still firing sporadically. David oriented himself and began moving south, each step a fresh agony. He recovered a damaged pulse rifle from the wreckage, its charge depleted except for a single shot. Better than nothing. As he crested a ridge overlooking the ravine, the devastation below stole his breath. The convoy had been caught in a perfect crossfire. Some transports lay overturned, others reduced to smoking husks. Colonial militia fought a desperate rearguard action, buying time for survivors to flee toward the plateau on foot. And there, at the center of it all, was Lyra, her simple colony clothes now torn and dust-covered, as she helped wounded colonists toward the safety of a rocky overhang. Even from this distance, David could see the determination in her stance, the refusal to abandon these people who weren't her subjects, but had become her responsibility. A flash of movement caught his eye. Lieutenant Chen, pinned down behind a wrecked transport, exchanging fire with approaching Valkyrie troops. But something was wrong with the way she moved, a precision that seemed suddenly too perfect, too calculated. David's blood ran cold as realization struck. Chen's suspicious questions, her perfect positioning during the ambush, the way she'd insisted on knowing exactly where they were headed. The Nexus infiltrator had been by his side all along. David watched in horror as Chen broke cover, moving with inhuman speed toward Lyra's position. No human could move like that. This wasn't his lieutenant, but something wearing her form. The real Chen was likely dead, replaced before the attack even began. He had one shot, one chance. David steadied his breathing, raised the damaged pulse rifle, and took aim. The distance was extreme, the weapon compromised, his hands shaking from blood loss and adrenaline. It was an impossible shot. He fired. The pulse blast caught the false Chen squarely between the shoulder blades. It stumbled, its disguise flickering momentarily to reveal a glimpse of something pallid and alien beneath the human facade. But it didn't fall. Instead, it turned, eyes locking onto David's position with mechanical precision. His diversion had worked. The creature changed course, abandoning its pursuit of Lyra to eliminate this new threat. David turned and ran, drawing it away from the survivors, his body screaming in protest with each step. He led the creature toward a narrow canyon, a dead end, but the only option available. Behind him, it moved with relentless purpose, no longer bothering to maintain its human appearance. Its true form was a nightmare of pale, semi-translucent flesh, stretched over an exoskeleton that mimicked human anatomy with disturbing imprecision. David's lungs burned as he reached the canyon's end, turning to face the approaching horror. No weapons, no backup, no escape. But he bought Lyra time. That would have to be enough. Lieutenant Hayes, the creature spoke with Chen's voice emerging from its inhuman mouth, the effect profoundly unsettling. You've proven unexpectedly troublesome. I get that a lot, David replied, searching frantically for anything he could use as a weapon. His hand closed around a jagged rock, pitifully inadequate, but he'd die fighting. Your death will be examined closely, it continued, advancing steadily. The Nexus finds human resilience fascinating, particularly yours. David tensed, preparing for his final stand. Tell your masters they'll never win. Humanity doesn't break easily. We don't seek to break humanity, the creature replied with an almost pitying tone. We seek to perfect it. It lunged forward with inhuman speed, only to be thrown backward as the canyon wall beside David exploded outward in a shower of rock and dust. Through the debris stepped a figure in sleek combat armor, face concealed behind a tactical helmet, wielding a weapon unlike anything in the colonial arsenal. Get down, a female voice commanded. David dropped as a pulse of blue energy erupted from the weapon, engulfing the Nexus creature. It convulsed, its form destabilizing before collapsing into a puddle of rapidly dissipating matter. The armored figure turned to David, faceplate retracting to reveal familiar violet eyes. Lyra? He gasped in disbelief. Not exactly, she replied with a smile that mirrored Lyra's, but somehow wasn't hers. Captain Alessia Tavik, Royal Concordat Special Forces. I'm Princess Lyra's personal guard and body double. David's mind reeled. Body double. Then whoa. Eyes with your colonists. The real Princess Lyra Estrella, Alessia answered, helping him to his feet. I've been shadowing her since she arrived on New Terra, maintaining position as emergency backup. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. The woman he'd protected, argued with, admired, had truly been the princess all along. Not a body double, not an imposter. We need to move, Alessia urged, supporting David's weight as they exited the canyon. Your colonists have reached the repository entrance. Lyra's unlocking it now, but the Valkyrie have begun bombardment prep. We have minutes, not hours. They half ran, half stumbled toward the southern plateau, David fighting through pain with each step. The sky above them had darkened further, the Valkyrie destroyers aligning into bombardment formation. The first preliminary energy surges were visible as atmospheric disturbances rippling across the heavens, the precursor to planetary devastation. As they crested the final ridge, David saw them. Hundreds of colonists gathered before a massive stone formation that was sliding open to reveal an entrance lined with material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. At the threshold stood Lyra, the real Lyra, her hands placed on an authentication panel that pulsed with soft blue light. Their eyes met across the distance, and even amid chaos, something passed between them. Recognition, relief, connection. She was never supposed to reveal herself, Alessia explained as they hurried toward the group. The plan was for her to access the repository data and depart without anyone learning her identity. But then she met you. The first bombardment strike hit 20 kilometers north, the shockwave reaching them seconds later. The ground heaved beneath their feet as a column of superheated air and vaporized earth rose toward the stratosphere. Inside, now, Lyra shouted as the repository doors opened fully, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The colonists rushed in, carrying their wounded, clutching whatever possessions they'd managed to save. David reached her side as the last colonists entered. You lied to me, he said, without real accusation. I omitted certain details, she corrected, a hint of the imperious princess showing through. And I never lied about what matters. Another bombardment strike hit, closer this time, the pressure wave nearly knocking them off their feet. Alessia pushed them both toward the entrance. Reunion later, survival now. They stepped through the threshold just as the massive doors began closing. The repository beyond was a marvel, a cavernous space illuminated by soft light emanating from the walls themselves. The architecture was human, but with elements that seemed older, more advanced than current technology. Hundreds of colonists stared in wonder at data terminals rising from the floor like crystal formations. Lyra moved purposefully toward the central platform, her fingers dancing across controls that responded to her touch. "The repository is awakening," she announced. "And it's more than just a data storage facility." The entire chamber hummed with energy as dormant systems activated. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing maps of human space with pulsing indicators revealing Nexus infiltration points, hundreds of them, embedded within the highest levels of government, military, and corporate power. "This is what my father discovered," Lyra said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. "The evidence that got him killed. The truth about the puppets walking among us, wearing human faces." A deep rumble shook the repository as another bombardment strike hit nearby, this one close enough to test the ancient shielding. Dust rained from the ceiling, but the structure held. "Evidence won't help if we're all dead," David pointed out, checking the wounded with a medic's practiced eye. Lyra's smile contained a secret as she pressed her palm against a previously hidden panel. "This repository doesn't just contain data, Lieutenant Hayes. It contains our salvation." The floor beneath them shifted as hidden mechanisms engaged. The sensation of movement spread throughout the chamber, not downward as might be expected, but lateral. The entire repository was moving. "It's a ship," David realized with sudden understanding. "The oldest in the human fleet," Lyra confirmed. "Built during the first expansion era and hidden here when the Nexus infiltration was initially detected. My ancestors created these repositories not just to store evidence, but as arcs. Preservation vessels designed to survive even planetary destruction." On the holographic displays, they could see the massive repository structure disengaging from the surrounding plateau, energy shields deflecting the intensifying Valkyrie bombardment. Ancient engines, dormant for centuries, roared to life. "Can it reach orbit?" David asked, professional assessment taking over from awe. "It can reach Earth," Lyra replied confidently. "With evidence no one can deny, and 300 witnesses to testify about what really happened here. The Nexus has operated from shadows for too long. It's time to drive them into the light." As the repository ship ascended through New Terra's atmosphere, the colonists gathered around viewports to witness their world vanishing beneath them. Not refugees, David realized, but something more important. Messengers carrying truth that could save humanity from an enemy it didn't even know existed. Lyra stood beside him, no longer hiding behind a false identity. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "More than once. You saved my colony," he replied. "Most of them, anyway." Grief passed across her features. Not enough. Never enough. Impulsively, David took her hand. "My father was a mining engineer. He used to say that pressure either crushes or creates diamonds. These people won't break. Neither will you." Something changed in Lyra's expression, the composed princess giving way to the woman beneath. "When we reach Earth, I'll need allies I can trust. People the Nexus hasn't touched." Her eyes met his, question unspoken but clear. Before David could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. Alessia rushed toward them, her expression grave. Multiple vessels approaching. Valkyrie configuration, but different. Larger. On the main display, massive ships unlike any they'd seen before emerged from hyperspace. Not Valkyrie design, but something more ancient, more terrible. Ships that made the Valkyrie destroyers look like toys by comparison. "The Masters revealing themselves," Lyra whispered, her face pale. The true face of the Nexus, as the ancient repository ship accelerated toward Earth carrying its precious cargo of truth and survivors. The real battle for humanity's future was only beginning. And at its center stood an unlikely pair, a princess who had learned the value of every human life, and a colonial lieutenant who had discovered that protecting one woman could mean saving an entire species. What neither of them suspected was that the Nexus had anticipated this moment for centuries, that the repository, their supposed salvation, contained one final, terrible secret even the royal family had never discovered. a secret waiting patiently in the ship's ancient code, biding its time until the perfect moment to awaken. The repository ship shuddered as its ancient engines strained against the pursuit. On the command deck, colonial technicians worked alongside Lyra and Alessia, rediscovering the vessel's capabilities through desperate necessity. David moved among the injured, his own wounds hastily treated but still painful with each breath. "They're gaining," Alessia reported, her fingers dancing across the unfamiliar controls. 3 minutes until they're in weapons range. Lyra's face remained composed, though David could see the tension in her shoulders. The hyperspace drive. Still charging. The systems are ancient. They need time to fully awaken. David joined them at the command console, studying the tactical display where 5 massive Nexus vessels spread out in an intercept pattern. Their design was unsettlingly organic, as though they'd been grown rather than constructed. "We can't outrun them, and we can't outfight them." "We don't need to," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "We just need to outsmart them." She accessed a deeper level of the ship's systems, revealing a star chart with a plotted course that didn't lead toward Earth, but toward a nearby nebula, a swirling mass of cosmic dust and radiation that would normally be avoided by any sensible navigator. "The Kelderan Nebula," David questioned. "The radiation would fry our systems before we got halfway through." A ghost of a smile touched Lyra's lips. "That's what everyone is meant to think. It's not a natural formation. It's a defensive screen, established during the first expansion era. A sanctuary hidden in plain sight." Alessia looked up sharply. "Your Highness, that information is restricted to the royal family alone." "And soon it won't matter who knows," Lyra replied, making her decision. "Plot a course for the nebula. Maximum speed." The ship banked sharply, accelerating toward the glowing cosmic cloud. Behind them, the Nexus vessels adjusted course in pursuit, closing the distance with relentless efficiency. "Even if we reach the nebula," David said, "what then? We need to warn Earth about what's coming." "And we will," Lyra assured him, her hand briefly touching his in a gesture that felt surprisingly natural. "But first, we need to understand what we're truly fighting." The ship's systems suddenly flickered, displays glitching before stabilizing. Alessia scanned the diagnostics with growing concern. "Something's accessing the mainframe. An internal breach." David's mind flashed to Lyra's earlier words about a secret within the repository itself. Could the Nexus have planted something inside the ship? A dormant program or... "Not the Nexus," came a voice from behind them. They turned to find a holographic figure materializing at the center of the command deck, a tall woman in Arctic formal attire, her features bearing a striking resemblance to Lyra's. "Security Protocol Omega," the figure continued, its voice echoing with artificial modulation. "Genetic authentication confirmed. Lyra Astraea, royal bloodline verified. Emergency protocols initiated." Lyra stepped forward, recognition and confusion mingling in her expression. "You're modeled after Queen Ilara, my ancestor from the Unification era." The hologram nodded. "I am an artificial intelligence construct created by Queen Ilara Astraea during the First Contact Crisis, when the true nature of the Nexus was initially discovered." The revelation rippled through the command deck. Colonists gathered around, their faces reflecting shock and wonder as centuries of hidden history unfolded before them. "Your ancestress recognized that conventional weapons would be ineffective against an enemy that infiltrates rather than invades," the AI continued. "The repositories were created not merely as data storage or escape vessels, but as the foundation for humanity's true defense." The ship lurched as a glancing blow from a Nexus energy weapon struck their shields. Alessia called out, "Shields at 60%. We can't take another direct hit." "The nebula," Lyra urged. "How much longer?" 90 seconds to perimeter," Alessia replied, her hand steady despite the pressure. The AI's expression remained serene amid the chaos. "The nebula contains what remains of the progenitor network, a defense system designed to detect and neutralize Nexus infiltration at the cellular level. Queen Ilara sacrificed much to create it, including altering the royal bloodline itself to serve as both key and conduit. Another impact rocked the ship. Warning lights flashed across control panels as systems struggled to compensate. Shields at 40%. Alessia reported. What does that mean? Conduit? David asked, steadying himself against a console. Instead of answering directly, the AI turned to Lyra. You have felt it all your life, haven't you? The connection to something beyond yourself, the ability to sense falsehood in others. These were not coincidences or intuition, but the dormant network responding to your presence. Lyra's hand went instinctively to her temple. The dreams, the headaches whenever I was near high-level government functions. Your body recognizing Nexus proxies, the AI confirmed. A defense mechanism built into your genetic code, waiting to be fully activated. The ship shuddered again as another blast struck them. 30 seconds to nebula perimeter, Alessia called out. If we reach the nebula, David asked, what happens then? The eye's holographic form flickered as power systems reallocated energy to shields. The princess must make a choice. Activate the network and fulfill her ancestral purpose, or continue running in the hope that conventional resistance might someday prevail. What does activating the network entail? Lyra asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Complete neural integration, the AI replied simply. Your consciousness would become the controlling intelligence for the network. You would be its voice, its judgment, its will. And the cost. David interjected, stepping closer to Lyra. Separation from physical form, the AI stated without emotion. What you would call death, though it is more accurately, a transformation. The command deck fell silent despite the chaos of battle around them. David looked at Lyra, seeing not a princess, but a young woman faced with an impossible choice. Sacrifice herself entirely or risk the future of humanity. There has to be another way, he insisted, turning to the AI. Your creators had centuries of technological advancement. They couldn't have designed a system that requires suicide to activate. Not suicide, the AI corrected. Transcendence. And yes, they sought alternatives, but the nature of the Nexus threat required a human consciousness as firewall, something the Nexus could never fully predict or infiltrate. Nebula perimeter in 10 seconds, Alessia announced. The pursuing Nexus vessels unleashed a full barrage, their combined firepower closing in on the fleeing ship. Just as the energy weapons were about to hit, the repository ship crossed into the nebula. The expected impact never came. Instead, the energy weapons dissipated against the nebula's outer boundary, their power absorbed and redirected by unseen defenses. Beyond the boundary, the nebula's chaotic exterior gave way to a vast hidden space, a massive artificial structure disguised as a cosmic phenomenon. At its center floated what appeared to be a space station of impossible scale and design, pulsing with dormant energy. The progenitor hub, the AI announced, waiting 300 years for its final activation. The ship automatically docked with the ancient station, systems integrating with a structure built by hands long since turned to dust. As the colonists disembarked into the vast interior spaces, they discovered supplies, living quarters, and technology beyond their understanding, a sanctuary prepared for this very moment. On the station's command level, Lyra stood before the activation chamber, a crystalline structure designed for a single occupant. David and Alessia remained by her side as she considered her choice. If I do this, Lyra said quietly, what becomes of these people? Of Earth? Of everything I've known? You would become their guardian, the AI replied. The network extends throughout human space, dormant nodes waiting for your consciousness to awaken them. You would identify every Nexus infiltrator simultaneously, enabling resistance forces to act in a coordinated strike. David took Lyra's hand, no longer concerned with protocol or station. There has to be a compromise. Some way you can activate the network without losing yourself completely. The AI tilted its head, considering. The original protocol was designed for permanent integration. However, it paused, processing. Queen Ilara's final updates included theoretical modifications for temporary neural linking. Untested, but potentially viable. Hope flickered across Lyra's features, meaning I could activate the network, complete the mission, and return. With significant risk, the AI cautioned. The human mind was not designed to channel such power, even temporarily. The probability of complete neural burnout is approximately 63%. Better odds than humanity has against the Nexus right now, Lyra replied with grim determination. David stepped forward. I'm going with you. Alessia immediately objected. Lieutenant, that's not possible. Only the royal bloodline can. Actually, the AI interrupted. Lieutenant Hayes's neural patterns display unusual compatibility with the network architecture. His presence could potentially serve as an anchor for the princess's consciousness, improving survival probability by 22%. Lyra looked at David with new understanding. That's why you could sense the Nexus agent when others couldn't. Why you survived when you should have died. You're compatible. A genetic anomaly present in less than 0.003% of the population. The AI confirmed. Exceedingly rare, but fortuitous under current circumstances. The station trembled slightly as the Nexus vessels positioned themselves around the nebula's perimeter, probing for weaknesses, but unable to penetrate its defenses. Yet, they'll find a way through eventually, Alessia warned. Lyra squared her shoulders. Decision made. Prepare the activation chamber for 2. Lieutenant Hayes and I will establish the link together. As they stepped toward the chamber, David caught her arm. Why did you really reveal yourself to me? You could have maintained your cover, accessed the repository, and completed your mission without ever telling me who you were. A genuine smile touched Lyra's lips. Because you showed me what my father always tried to teach me. That every life matters. That duty without compassion isn't leadership at all. She paused. And because I trusted you, still do. The chamber doors sealed behind them as they took their positions within the crystalline structure. As neural interfaces extended toward them, David reached across the small space between them, taking Lyra's hand one final time. Whatever happens, he said, it was an honor to shield you, Princess. Her fingers tightened around his. Where we're going, Lieutenant, I suspect it will be you who needs protection. The interfaces connected, and their world dissolved into light, their separate consciousnesses expanding outward through the ancient network, awakening dormant systems across human space. Together, they became something neither human nor machine, but a perfect synthesis, the sword that would excise the Nexus infiltration from humanity's body politic. And somewhere within that vast new consciousness, a colonial lieutenant and a princess in disguise held on to each other, determined to find their way home when their impossible mission was complete. Throughout human space, the battle for humanity's soul had only just begun. But for the first time in centuries, it would be fought in the light.